Welcome to Building Singleton Event Measures. This lesson will demonstrate how to create a singleton event measure. Singleton measures can be created with a single denominator object that contains the data required to calculate the measure's numerator and denominator contributions. Where many performance measures require at least one denominator object for calculating the measure's denominator contribution and at least one numerator object for calculating the measure's numerator contribution, singleton measures can be created with as little as one denominator object. Unlike previous lessons, we will use the blank measure template to create this measure. This template does not construct any of the measure's specifications and logic like the templates we've used before. When creating a measure without the guidance of a template, you are still presented with a template-like screen for defining some basic parameters. We're going to build a measure that reports the percentage of nephrologist office visits where the principal diagnosis is CKD stage 3 or higher. We'll use the measure nickname nephrologist visits with CKD diagnosis greater than or equal to stage 3 to describe this concept in less than 50 characters. Under measure identifier, we'll enter CKD-101. This measure will report the percentage of events with a certain characteristic, so we'll leave the temporal class as event. A measure's component class specifies for each denominator record whether there can be at most one corresponding numerator record or many corresponding numerator records. When there is at most one numerator record associated with a denominator record, the measure's component class is referred to as normal form. However, when there are potentially many numerator records associated with each denominator record, the measure's component class is long form. This measure is being created from an object that contains both the denominator and numerator contributions, and there can be at most one numerator event for each denominator event. That is, among all the nephrologist office visits contained in the object, only some of them will have a principal diagnosis of CKD stage 3 or higher. This being the case, we will leave the component class field set to normal form. Finally, we can specify the measure's denominator object and then select Create Measure. The first thing we want to do is go to the Configuration panel and select the No Numerator Stacks option, which will remove the numerator stack. This action is what indicates to Ursa Studio that we're creating a singleton measure. While we're here, we can confirm that the auto-detected denominator case field choice, encounter ID, is correct. Before specifying the remaining measure properties, let's go back to the denominator base object and complete a few preliminary steps for this measure. For the sake of example, I'm going to select then unselect the Inherit Field Settings from Object checkbox, which will select all the fields associated with the object. While this is an easy way to select all fields, you probably want to take a more discerning approach to field selection when you're doing this on your own. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, the denominator base object contains all the necessary data for calculating the measure's numerator and denominator contributions, but we need to transform that data into a usable format before specifying those contributions. The task at hand is to create a field that flags ICD-9 and 10 codes associated with CKD stages 3, 4, and 5 so that we have a flag to calculate the numerator's results. We could accomplish this in several different ways. Most notably, we could create a value set with the codes and then invoke the isInValueSet pattern as a derived field. We could also use a single case when pattern, which is the equivalent of a SQL case statement. However, in this example, we'll use multiple case when patterns coupled with a coalesce pattern to accomplish this objective. This strategy allows us to create a flag for each of the 6 ICD-9 and 10 codes, then combine all of those flags into a single field we can use for calculating the numerator. While on the face this may sound like more work, it'll actually take less time because we can clone or duplicate patterns. It also has the advantage of providing the most easily discerned documentation of the transformation work for other users. So we'll start by selecting the Add Derived Field button and then choosing the Case When pattern. When the pattern is selected, it provides us a template for specifying a case statement, which allows us to specify if, then else logic. First, we specify the field that contains the value of interest. In this case, the principal diagnosis ICD-9-CM code. Next, we'll specify the equal sign as the operator required. Then we can specify that the code's value is stored as a string, which is a data type used for storing sequences of characters. In this next field, we will enter the value 585.3, which is the ICD-9 code for CKD Stage 3. We'll specify then as the option of choice in this next field. Next, we'll select the number option and enter 1 in the field provided. Now we'll specify the else condition, which will be a null value. In many situations, we might specify this value to be 0, so that the field provides a 1 if the condition is true and a 0 if it's false. In this case, we are electing the null choice because we're going to use a coalesce pattern, which relies on null values to combine the fields we create for ICD-9 and 10 codes. So let's recap what we just defined. We've specified that when the principal diagnosis ICD-9-CM code is equal to 585.3, the derived field should contain the value of 1, otherwise the field should be null. Now we'll go ahead and name this field ICD-9-CM Principal Diagnosis Code equals 585.3, which is precise, if not the most human-friendly description. We do not need to publish this field, so we can leave this option as unpublished. This field does not need to be analytic because we're not going to use it for splitting this measure in Analytics Portal. The origin field's default value, subpopulation, also does not need to be changed as the field is associated with the denominator object. We can leave the default option for the field group, even though the field is not going to be published. Let's add a block header because we're going to create a block of conceptually related fields. Something like indicates if office visits ICD-9-CM diagnosis is CKD Stage 3, 4, or 5. We can enter a comment for this specific field, something like field indicates ICD-9-CM diagnosis of CKD Stage 3. Now we're going to clone this measure by clicking the clone icon to the right of the pattern name. Now we'll need to make a few updates. First, we're going to update the ICD-9 code to 585.4 in the case statement and field name. Next, we'll update the comment to show the new diagnosis code flags CKD Stage 4 diagnoses. Now we can save this pattern. At this point, you've seen how to complete a case-when pattern and clone patterns. I'm going to complete the rest of this work so we can get to the final derived field we will create, which will be used to specify the numerator contribution. To complete this transformation work, we're going to add one last derived field using the coalesce pattern. This pattern will be familiar to those of you who have SQL development experience. The pattern will take the first non-null value from a list of fields we provide. This will have the effect of combining all the fields we just created into a single field. First, we'll tab into the Patterns and select the Prop option from the dropdown. This will open another dropdown where we can select Principal Diagnosis ICD-9 CM code equals 585.3 as our first field. Next, we select the Prop option and select our second field, Principal Diagnosis ICD-9 CM code 585.4. Then we tab to the plus sign icon to add another field, and I'll repeat this process until all of the fields we've created have been added. Once all of the fields have been added, we can complete the pattern. We'll start by naming this field Is Principal Diagnosis CKD Stage 3, 4, or 5. We want to publish this field, so we'll go ahead and make that selection here. And we will probably want to split on this field, so we'll update the selection to Analytic. The origin field's default value, subpopulation, also does not need to be changed, nor does the default field group. We will add a block header to display to other users that this new field is in its own conceptual category. We will call this one Indicates Principal Diagnosis CKD Stage 3, 4, or 5. The block header provides enough commentary about this field, so we don't need to enter a comment. So those transformations have yielded us a field that we can use to calculate the numerator contribution, which we will specify in one moment. Now we've completed all the work that needed to be done at the level of the denominator base object. Next, we'll check one option on the denominator stack level by clicking the word Measure. We want to quickly check that the subpopulation effective date field, which is the field that's used to tie denominator observations to reporting periods, has been set. It has, so we only need to click this check mark to confirm that it is correct. Now we can finish specifying this measure's properties. We can update the measure naming properties. The ID and the nickname are already set, so we just need to add the measure name. Among nephrologist office visits, those with a principal diagnosis of CKD Stage 3 or higher. We'll also use this as the measure description, which is fairly common practice. We have already reviewed the configuration panel, so we only need to add the measure contributions and specify the measure's metadata. The numerator and denominator contributions are instructions the platform uses to calculate the measure's results. First, we'll specify the numerator contribution. We'll start by selecting this case is null pattern from the dropdown. Next, we can select the field that we just created. The field will be null unless it meets the condition of being associated with a nephrologist office visit with a principal diagnosis code of CKD Stage 3, 4, or 5. If the field is null, we want the numerator contribution to be 0. Otherwise, we want the numerator contribution to be 1. That's all we need to do to specify the numerator contribution. Because we want each denominator record to contribute the count of 1, we can select the 1 per case pattern, which does not need additional parameters specified. So the numerator and denominator contributions are all set. Now just a few metadata items to specify. We will set process measure as default measure domain. As this is an event measure, we'll set the measure distribution to binomial. We'll set the measure precision to 2, though we could use any option that would suit the circumstances. The measure range is binary, and the unit of measure is percentage. We don't need to set a target direction or a target, but we will make sure the patient identifier field is set to patient ID, which it is. So we can click the check mark to confirm the system made the right decision. If we needed to, we could set a default field group, but we inherited the fields and field groups from the denominator base object. That's all we need to do to specify the measure, and all that's left to do is save it. So let's take a moment to review this measure in Analytics Portal. Here is the fruit of our labor. We reviewed the measure as is displayed to understand the results over time. We can also open it as a pie chart to see the distribution of results or any of the other available chart types. And of course, we can also explore case-level details about the measure as desired. We have reached the end of this lesson. You now know how to create a Singleton event measure. Thank you for taking a moment to review this lesson, and I'll catch you in the next one.